The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to the Iowa landscape as the cawing of crows or the rustle of dry cornstalks in a November wind. It was a sound of endings. Jedediah Stone stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, the collar of his canvas work coat turned up against a wind that had a bite to it. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He was here to watch, to bear witness. This was the Miller place, or what used to be the Miller place. Old man Miller had worked this same black dirt for 50 years, same as Jed's father had. But his sons, they'd gotten ambitious in the late 60s. They'd listened to the university extension agents and the smooth-talking bankers, bought a brand-new six-bottom plow and a shiny International 1256 with a cab and a radio. They'd tried to farm an extra quarter section they couldn't afford, and one bad year of drought followed by a year of cheap corn had been all it took. Now their shiny dreams were being sold off, piece by rusty piece, to settle the note. Jed's eyes scanned the machinery line. The 1256 sat there looking embarrassed, a fine coat of dust covering its immaculate red paint. It had fewer than 1,000 hours on the tachometer, a practically new machine already on the chopping block. Jed shook his head. His own main tractor, a John Deere 4020, had rolled past 10,000 hours so long ago the meter had broken. It didn't have a cab, just a faded green umbrella for the summer sun, and the seat vinyl was split open, leaking yellow foam. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every grease-stained fitting belonged to him and nobody else. A brand-new Ford F-250, chrome gleaming even under the grey sky, crunched to a stop on the gravel lane. The door opened and out stepped Richard Miller. No relation to the family losing their farm. If anything, he was the opposite. Rich was the new king of the county. He was Jed's age, but he moved with an easy confidence that came from a wallet full of the bank's money. He saw Jed and sauntered over, a smirk already playing on his lips. He was wearing clean boots. That's the first thing Jed always noticed about men like Rich. Their boots were never truly broken in. "Come to pick over the bones, Jed?" Rich asked, his voice a little too loud. "Just watchin'," Jed said, his gaze not leaving the auctioneer. "Sad, isn't it?" Rich said, though he didn't sound sad at all. "They tried to run with the big dogs but couldn't keep up. You can't make a living with a 10-year-old tractor anymore. It's a new game." He gestured vaguely at the Miller boys' equipment. "They bought this 1256, thought they were really stepping up. Me, I got a 1466 on order, turbocharged. Biggest two-wheel drive International makes, gonna pull a 24-foot disc like it's not even there." Jed just grunted. He'd heard all about Rich's new tractor. Everyone in the county had. Rich talked about it like it was the second coming. "You ought to think about upgrading, Jed," Rich pressed on, enjoying his audience of one. "That old 4020 of yours, it's a museum piece. How do you even get parts for it?" "I manage," Jed said flatly. The auctioneer moved on to a set of old hand tools. Jed's interest perked up. He could always use a good set of pipe wrenches. He saw a heavy-duty pair, probably half a century old, made of real American steel, not the cheap pot metal they were selling now. The bidding started at $2. Jed raised a finger. $3. $4. He was about to nod for $5 when Rich's voice cut through the air. $10. The crowd quieted. $10 for a used wrench was ridiculous. The auctioneer's head snapped toward Rich, surprised. "I got $10. Do I hear 11? He looked at Jed. Jed just slowly shook his head and let his arms fall to his sides. It wasn't about the wrench. It was about the message. "Sold for $10 to Mr. Miller." Rich didn't even bother to pick up his prize. He just gave Jed a wink. "See, Jed, you gotta be willing to spend it. Can't be scared of the money." He clapped Jed on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove, and walked off toward the banker who was standing by his shiny truck, a folder full of papers in his hand. Jed watched them go, the banker smiling and nodding as Rich talked, probably laying out his plans to buy up this farm once the bank officially took it back. Jed felt a slow, cold anger coiling in his gut. It wasn't just about Rich's arrogance, it was about the whole damn thing. The idea that you were only as good as your newest piece of iron, that a man's worth was measured by the size of his operating loan. His father's words echoed in his head, as they often did when he was troubled. "Debt is a chain, son. The longer it gets, the heavier it feels. You own your land and you own your iron, you're a free man. You owe the bank for 'em, you're just a high-paid sharecropper working for the man in the suit. Jed turned and walked back to his truck, a 1965 Chevy C50, with a faded blue door and a rust hole in the fender you could put your fist through. It wasn't pretty, but it started every time, and the title was in his glove box, not in a filing cabinet at the bank. He drove home, the familiar rattle of the cab and the whine of the straight-six engine a comforting sound. He pulled into his own lane, past the modest white farmhouse and the big red barn with its fading coat of paint. His machinery was parked in a neat line behind the barn. The John Deere 4020, the old Farmall M he used for raking hay, the Gleaner E combine that was small but simple to fix. And at the end of the line, sitting on a patch of ground he'd cleared, was his ace in the hole. It was a 1954 Alice Chalmers HD5 crawler, a Dozer, 10 tons of pure, unadulterated American iron. Its orange paint was mostly gone, faded to a chalky memory and replaced by patches of surface rust. The blade had more weld lines than original steel, and the seat was just a steel pan. But the undercarriage was solid, and deep within its belly was the heart of the beast, a 2-cylinder, 2-stroke Detroit diesel 2-71 engine. Jed swung himself up into the operator's seat. There was no key, just a master switch and a starter button. He flipped the switch, heard the hum of the electronics, and pushed the button. The starter motor groaned for a second, then the Detroit roared to life. It wasn't a smooth rumble like the 6-cylinder in his Deere. It was an angry, clattering, screaming roar, a sound that promised to tear the world apart. The whole machine vibrated with barely contained power. He engaged the clutch, pushed the throttle forward, and the little Dozer lurched ahead, its steel tracks clanking and grinding, leaving deep waffle prints in the damp soil. He spent the rest of the afternoon clearing an old fence row, pushing over rotted posts and tangled wire like they were nothing. The smell of diesel exhaust and hot metal filled the air. With every push of the blade, with every roar of the engine, the anger from the auction faded, replaced by a deep, satisfying sense of control. This machine was his. It answered to him and him alone. It didn't care about interest rates or commodity prices. It only cared about work. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, Jed stopped the Dozer and let the engine idle down to its signature, loping clatter. He looked across the valley toward Rich Miller's place. He could see the lights of a brand-new machine shed, a palace of steel that had cost more than Jed's entire farm was worth. He thought about the two paths, his and Rich's. One was slow, steady, and paid for. The other was fast, shiny, and built on a mountain of paper held by men in suits. Before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks listening, which side of the fence would you have been on back then? Jed's, with everything paid for but old? Or Rich's, with the best new iron money could buy, even if it was the bank's money? Let me know down in the comments what you think. It was a question every farmer had to answer for himself in those days, and the wrong answer could cost you everything. The following spring came in wet and cold, the ground was saturated, and every farmer in the county was on edge, waiting for a dry spell to get in the fields. When the window finally came, it was narrow. A week of sun and wind, the old-timers predicted, and then more rain. You had to go, and you had to go hard. Jed had his 4020 hooked to the 6-row planter, the seed boxes filled, the fertilizer tanks topped off. He was making his second pass across the back 80 when he felt it. A slight shudder, a hesitation in the engine's steady rhythm. Then a loud metallic pop, like a rifle shot, echoed from under the hood. The engine screamed for a second, then seized with a sickening, grinding crunch. A plume of white smoke, thick and oily, billowed out from under the cowling and drifted across the field. Jed's heart sank into his stomach. He knew that sound. He killed the ignition and jumped down from the operator's station, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. He unlatched the side panel of the engine compartment. The smell of burnt oil was overwhelming. A connecting rod had let go. It had punched a jagged fist-sized hole clean through the side of the engine block. Oil was pouring out, black and thick, onto the dirt below. The engine was destroyed. Not just broken, but catastrophically, irrecoverably ruined. It was the middle of planting season. A new engine block, if he could even find one, would cost thousands. A dealer repair job would be even more, and they were weeks behind as it was. This was the kind of breakdown that put men like the Miller boys out of business. For a long moment, Jed just stood there, his hand on the hot, silent engine. He could feel the panic trying to creep in, a cold, tight feeling in his chest. He looked out across the half-planted field. Every minute he stood here, his window of opportunity was closing. Then he saw it. On the road that ran along his property line, a flash of red. It was Rich Miller in his brand-new International 1466, pulling a 24-row planter, a machine twice the size of Jed's. Rich slowed as he passed, the big turbocharged diesel rumbling. He didn't wave. He just stared, a look of what Jed could only describe as triumphant pity on his face. Then he throttled up, leaving a cloud of black diesel smoke hanging in the air as he sped off toward his own fields. That look was all it took. The panic inside Jed hardened into pure, stubborn resolve. He would not be beaten. He would not become a story told over coffee at the co-op diner. He walked back to the barn, the silence of his field a mocking contrast to the distant roar of Rich's new tractor. He didn't have the money for a dealer, and he didn't have the time to wait. He had to do this himself. The first step was getting the dead tractor out of the field. He fired up the old HD5 Dozer. The Detroit screamed to life, a defiant roar in the face of disaster. He carefully maneuvered the crawler out to the field, hooked a heavy chain to the 4020's front axle, and began the slow, arduous task of dragging his dead workhorse back to the workshop. For the next 2 days, Jed worked with a feverish intensity. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He rigged up a chain hoist to the main beam of his barn and began the painstaking process of pulling the engine. He drained the coolant and what was left of the oil, the familiar smells filling the workshop. He disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness, the throttle linkage, each part carefully labeled with a piece of masking tape. He fought with bolts that had been rusted in place for 20 years, his knuckles bleeding from slipping wrenches. He used a 3-foot breaker bar, his muscles straining to loosen the massive bolts that held the engine to the frame. Finally, with a groan of stressed metal, the engine was free. He hoisted it out and lowered it onto a set of heavy-duty sawhorses. The hole in the block was even worse than he'd thought. The cylinder sleeve was shattered, the piston was in pieces, and the crankshaft was likely bent. It was junk. He spent half a day on the phone, calling every tractor salvage yard in a 3-state radius. Most of them laughed when he asked for a 4020 engine block. Those tractors were legendary. Nobody junked them unless they were completely wrecked. Finally, a gruff voice from a yard in southern Minnesota gave him a glimmer of hope. Got one. Pulled it from a tractor that burned. Block should be good, but you'll have to get it magnafluxed to check for cracks. Head's probably warped. Be $300 for the bare block. You come get it. It was a gamble, but it was the only one he had. He loaded his old grain truck with a spare tire and a toolbox, took $200 from the coffee can in the kitchen, and started the 4-hour drive north. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting iron, acres of dead tractors lined up in neat, depressing rows. The owner, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his face, led him to the engine. It was a greasy, fire-scorched mess, but the block looked intact. Jed paid the man, and together they used a forklift to load the heavy block onto the back of his truck. The next week was a blur of greasy, back-breaking labor. He took the block to a machine shop in town, holding his breath as they checked it for cracks. It came back clean. He spent hours cleaning every part, soaking pistons in diesel fuel, scrubbing away years of grime. He used his father's old valve spring compressor to rebuild the head from his old engine, carefully lapping the valves by hand until they seated perfectly. He ordered a new rebuild kit, pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets, from the John Deere dealer, the most expensive purchase he'd made in 5 years. The parts man looked at him with a mixture of pity and respect. Night after night, he worked under the single bare bulb in his shop, the radio playing softly in the background. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the engine, the precise torque specs for the head bolts, the proper gap for the piston rings, the delicate art of setting the timing. His hands, already calloused, became stained with grease and dotted with new cuts and burns. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who knew his machine down to its very soul. Meanwhile, the rain had come back as predicted. Rich Miller had gotten all his corn in the ground. Jed had 160 acres of bare dirt, the planting window closing with every drop that fell. The talk at the diner was that Jed Stone was finished. He'd missed his chance. Rich, holding court in his usual booth, would just shake his head and say, "Told him that old junk would catch up to him. A man's got to know when to let go of the past." Finally, after 9 straight days of work, it was done. The rebuilt engine was back in the tractor. Jed filled it with fresh oil and coolant, bled the fuel lines, and hooked up the battery. He stood back for a moment, his body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in his bones. He took a deep breath, climbed into the seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life. It wasn't sputtering or coughing. It settled into a smooth, powerful rhythm, a sound sweeter to Jed's ears than any symphony. He let it warm up, his eyes scanning the gauges. Oil pressure was good. Temperature was steady. He revved it a few times, and the engine responded instantly, a deep-throated rumble of reliable diesel power. He had done it. It was a small, private victory, witnessed only by the swallows nesting in the barn rafters, but it felt bigger than anything Rich Miller had ever accomplished with his checkbook. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. He still had a chance. The years that followed were, by all accounts, the best the American farmer had ever seen. It started around 73, with the Russians buying grain like it was going out of style. The price of corn doubled, then nearly tripled. Soybeans shot through the roof. Suddenly, the land was a gold mine, and every farmer with a tractor was a king. The government was screaming at them to plant fence row to fence row, and for once it seemed like a good idea. For men like Rich Miller, it was a license to print money. The windfall from the high commodity prices wasn't enough for him. It was just fuel for a bigger fire. He saw the boom not as a chance to get ahead, but as a chance to get bigger, much bigger. He used his new inflated land values as collateral to borrow staggering sums of money. The local banker, caught up in the euphoria, was happy to oblige. The first thing Rich did was buy the 160-acre Henderson farm that bordered Jed's property. He paid a price per acre that made the old-timers choke on their coffee. "Land is the one thing they ain't making more of," Rich would boast. "You gotta grab it when you can, whatever the cost." With more land came the need for more, bigger equipment. The 1466, which had been his pride and joy, was traded in for a brand-new John Deere 8630, a massive 8-wheeled articulated 4-wheel drive monster that looked more like a military vehicle than a tractor. It was the first one in the county, and Rich made sure everyone knew it. He'd drive it into town for no reason other than to park it in front of the diner, its enormous dual tires taking up 3 parking spaces. Next came a new combine. He bought a Gleaner N6, a rotary machine with a silver cab and more glass than a downtown storefront. It had air conditioning, a stereo, and a digital grain loss monitor. It could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time, twice what Jed's old machine could handle. To store all the grain, he put up 2 new Butler grain bins, each one holding 50,000 bushels, their shiny corrugated steel sides gleaming in the sun like monuments to his success. He even paved the long gravel driveway leading to his house. Rich was the toast of the town. He was the future. He was proof that the old ways of thrift and caution were for fools. He treated Jed with a kind of condescending pity. "Still tinkering with that old junk, Jed?" he'd ask, pulling up in his new truck while Jed was trying to weld a cracked bracket on his planter. "You're missing the boat. There's a fortune to be made out here, but you can't get it 6 rows at a time." Jed saw the boom, too. He had 2 of the most profitable years of his life. The checks from the grain elevator were bigger than any he'd ever seen. But he didn't see them as a blank check for the future. He saw them as a cushion, a storm shelter. The first thing he did was pay off the last remaining mortgage on the farm, a small note his father had taken out 20 years earlier. He walked into the bank and handed the teller a check for the full amount. The banker, Mr. Harris, came out of his office to shake Jed's hand. "Congratulations, Jed," he said. "It's not every day we get to burn a mortgage." But there was a strange look in his eye. Jed was a good customer, but he wasn't a profitable one. He didn't borrow, he didn't expand, he was a relic. Instead of buying new iron, Jed invested in his farm. He put a new steel roof on the big barn. He replaced the rotting wooden fences with new steel posts and woven wire. He bought a slightly newer, but still very used, John Deere 7000 planter, one that had better seed placement than his old one. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, he put into a savings account at the bank. He was building a wall, brick by brick, against the inevitable bad times he knew were coming. Farming was a cycle. His father had taught him that. 7 fat years, 7 lean years. These were the fat years. His neighbors saw it as a failure of nerve. They saw Rich Miller building an empire, and they saw Jed Stone patching his fences. They saw Rich as a visionary and Jed as a man stuck in the past, too scared to take a risk when the getting was good. "He doesn't have the guts to get big," Rich would say, and the other farmers would nod in agreement. "You got to get big or get out. That's the way it is now." Jed felt the isolation. At the co-op, conversations would stop when he walked up. He was a living contradiction to the new religion of debt and expansion. His quiet, debt-free existence was an unspoken criticism of their own choices, and they resented him for it. So he kept to himself, finding solace in his work and the steady, reliable rhythm of his old machines. One afternoon in the late summer of '79, Jed was at the bank depositing a check. As he stood at the counter, he could hear Mr. Harris on the phone in his office, his voice tight with worry. The door was ajar, and Jed could catch snippets of the conversation. "The prime rate is what? 16%? Paul Volcker is serious about this then. All our agricultural loans are on floating rates, Jim. Floating rates. How am I supposed to tell these guys their interest just doubled overnight? They can't cash flow that. Nobody can." Jed didn't understand all the financial talk, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of fear. He finished his transaction and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, a brand-new lowboy semi-truck was slowly navigating the corner, its horn blowing to warn traffic. On its trailer, gleaming like a giant yellow jewel, was Rich Miller's newest purchase, a Caterpillar D6 bulldozer, even bigger and more powerful than Jed's old Alice Chalmers. It was being delivered straight to his farm. Jed stood there and watched it go by, a massive, beautiful machine that represented the pinnacle of Rich's success. But all he could hear was the banker's panicked voice talking about interest rates and numbers that didn't add up. He looked at the massive, gleaming Dozer and then up at the clear blue sky, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the cold, unmistakable feeling of a coming storm. The storm, when it came, didn't arrive with thunder and lightning. It came through the mail, in thin white envelopes from the bank. It came over the radio, in the clipped, serious tones of newsmen from Des Moines and Chicago, talking about something called the prime interest rate. It was a silent, invisible tempest that flattened a man's balance sheet faster than a tornado could flatten his barn. The year was 1981, and the music had stopped. The price of corn, which had seemed destined to climb forever, fell off a cliff. It dropped by $1 a bushel, then another 50 cents. Land values, which had been Rich Miller's primary collateral, plummeted by 30, then 40%. Suddenly, the loans that had seemed so manageable were monstrous, anchored to assets that were worth a fraction of what they had been just a year before. And the interest rates, the ones the banker had whispered about in fear, they kept climbing. 16%, 18, 20. Jed saw the first real crack in Rich's empire, not in a bank statement, but in a field. It was planting season, and Jed was out with his rebuilt 4020 and the 7000 planter, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Across the fence line, Rich's massive John Deere 8630 sat silent in the middle of a half-planted field. It had been there for 2 days. On the third day, Jed saw the dealership's service truck pull up. 2 mechanics in clean coveralls spent the entire afternoon with the engine cowlings open, their heads buried in a tangle of hydraulic lines and wiring harnesses. That evening, Jed saw Rich at the parts counter at the dealership. Rich's face was pale, his usual cocksure swagger gone. He was arguing with the parts man, his voice a low, desperate hiss. "What do you mean you don't have it in stock? It's a hydraulic pump for your flagship tractor." "Have to order it from Moline, Rich," the parts man said calmly, not meeting his eyes. "Be here in 3 to 5 days, and the price, it's going to be close to $4,000. Rich just stared, his mouth slightly open. $4,000. For one part, and 5 days of perfect planting weather lost. He saw Jed standing by the door and his face hardened. He snatched the work order from the counter, scribbled his signature on it, and stalked out without a word. Jed just bought his oil filters and a set of new points for the Farmel M, paid in cash, and left. He didn't feel any satisfaction, just a deep, chilling unease. The new game, the one Rich had been so proud of, had rules that could change without warning. The cost of playing was getting too high for anyone. A few weeks later, the talk at the co-op was that Rich Miller was having trouble getting operating credit for fuel and fertilizer. He'd always run a tab, settling up after harvest. But the co-op manager, a man who had to answer to his own board, was tightening the screws on everyone. Jed saw Rich's semi-truck, the one he used to haul his own grain, sitting at the truck stop with a for sale sign taped to the window. He was selling off assets, trying to generate cash. It was the first sign of a man taking apart his own ship to feed the boiler. The real crisis, however, came at harvest time. It had been a dry summer and yields were down across the county. It wasn't a disaster, but it was the kind of year where you had to watch every penny. Jed's old Gleaner E combine chugged along, slow but steady. He broke a drive belt one afternoon, he had a spare in his toolbox and was running again in 20 minutes. The machine was simple, all belts and chains and pulleys. He understood it. Rich's new Gleaner N6, the Silver Palace with the air-conditioned cab, was a different story. It was a technological marvel, but it was also a mystery. Halfway through his corn, a sensor on the rotary separator failed. The machine, designed to protect itself from damage, shut the whole threshing system down. The dealer's mechanic, a young kid who relied more on a diagnostic computer than a wrench, couldn't figure it out. They had to fly in a specialist from the regional service center. The N6 sat idle for 4 days, while a perfect stretch of dry harvest weather slipped away. 4 days of interest payments on $500,000 of machinery, ticking away like a time bomb. Jed finished his harvest and had his grain in the bin before Rich was even half done. As the first wet snow of November began to fall, Rich was still out there, the lights of his big combine cutting through the flurries, racing against time and the bank. He was no longer the king of the county. He was just another man on a treadmill, running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The cold, hard truth was settling in all over the heartland. The machines that were supposed to set them free had become their masters, and the masters were demanding a price that no one could pay. The winter of 1982 was the quietest Jed could remember. The usual bustle of farmers buying parts, planning for the next year, and telling lies over coffee had been replaced by a heavy, anxious silence. The only sound that seemed to carry on the wind was the rhythmic drone of the auctioneer. It felt like there was a farm sale every Saturday. Good men Jed had known his whole life, were losing everything. Their names were printed in the classified section of the county paper. Their life's work listed in cold black type. 1 John Deere 4440, excellent rubber, 1 International 1460 combine, household goods and sundries. The bank, which had once been a partner in the boom, was now the executioner. Mr. Harris, the banker, aged 10 years in 6 months. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, weary grimace. The floating rate loans he had so eagerly written were now anchors, pulling his customers under. Rich Miller's turn came in March. The notice was nailed to a post at the end of his new paved driveway. Public auction. The bank had foreclosed. The empire had crumbled. On the day of the sale, the sky was a sheet of flat, unforgiving grey. A cold wind whipped across the yard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. The crowd was huge, bigger than for any other sale. They came not just to buy, but to see, to witness the fall of the man who had flown higher than anyone else. Jed parked his old Chevy C50 down the road and walked in. The scene was a grotesque parody of Rich's ambition. The massive John Deere 8630, the Gleaner N6, the Cat D6 Dozer, they were all lined up, numbered with grease pencil on their windshields, their newness a stark contrast to the grim proceedings. They looked like captured giants, humbled and waiting for a new master. Rich was there, standing near the house with his wife. He looked hollowed out. His face was gaunt, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he wore a coat that seemed too big for him, as if he'd physically shrunk. He wasn't talking, just staring at the ground as his neighbors, the same men he had once lauded his success over, picked through his tools and kicked the tires of his machines. Jed didn't go near the big equipment. He knew it was selling for pennies on the dollar, but it was still more than he would ever spend. He watched as the 8630, which Rich had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $35,000. The banker stood beside the auctioneer, his face like stone, nodding as the bids came in, knowing that every dollar was just a drop in an ocean of debt. While the main auction was focused on the big iron, Jed wandered back to the workshop. It was a state-of-the-art building, insulated and heated with rows of snap-on tool chests. But over in a dusty corner, piled on a workbench, was a collection of old tools. Hand tools. Jed saw the pair of heavy-duty pipe wrenches he had tried to buy at the Miller Boys auction all those years ago. They were tagged as part of a miscellaneous box lot. He waited. The auctioneer finally got to the box. "All right, folks, a whole box of odds and ends here. What do we bid? Give me $5 for the box." Jed raised a finger. "I got 5. Do I hear 10? $10. The crowd was silent. No one else wanted the old junk. "Sold, for $5 to Mr. Stone." Jed paid the clerk his $5 and picked up the box. He walked over to the wrenches and wiped the dust off them with his sleeve. Good American steel. He felt the familiar heft in his hands. While the auction finished up, Jed went back to his truck. He didn't stay to watch the bitter end. He had seen enough. The cycle was complete. That spring, Jed farmed his own land and watched as the Henderson place, the farm Rich had bought next door, sat empty. The bank owned it, but they couldn't find a buyer. No one had the money or the nerve to buy land. The fields grew up in foxtail and buttonweeds, a monument to a broken dream. Jed, meanwhile, was surviving. He wasn't getting rich, but his costs were low. His biggest expense was diesel fuel. His savings account, the one he'd built up during the good years, acted as a buffer against the dismal corn prices. His debt-free status meant he wasn't sending a check to the bank every month. He was an island. His old HD5 Dozer became a lifeline. The county road commissioner, his budget slashed, couldn't afford to hire big contractors anymore. He paid Jed cash under the table to use the old Alice Chalmers to clear out ditches and remove fallen trees after storms. The Detroit 2-71 would scream and clatter, pouring out smoke, but it always got the job done. That cash bought groceries and paid the electric bill. The 10 tons of paid-for iron was earning its keep. One slow, powerful push at a time. The sound of that engine was the sound of survival. A year after the auction, Jed was in town at the hardware store when he saw Rich Miller. Rich was loading bags of concrete into the trunk of a beat-up Ford sedan. He was wearing clothes from a discount store, and his hands, once soft from the climate-controlled cabs of his machines, were now rough and calloused. He was working for a construction crew in the city, an hour's drive each way. He had lost the house, the farm, everything. Rich saw Jed, and for a moment, his face flushed with the old shame and anger. He looked away, pretending he hadn't seen him. Jed walked over. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything about the farm. He just held out the old, heavy pipe wrenches. "I believe these are yours," Jed said quietly. Rich stared at the wrenches, then at Jed's face. He looked confused. "What?" "From the Miller Boys sale, a long time ago. You bought 'em. I picked 'em up at your sale. A man needs his tools." Rich looked at the wrenches in Jed's outstretched hand. He looked at Jed's weathered face, at the kindness in his eyes where he had expected to see gloating. Something inside him broke. His shoulders slumped, and he took the wrenches, his fingers tracing the familiar steel. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his head, a gesture that conveyed more than a whole speech. It was an admission, an apology, and a thank you, all at once. Jed just nodded back and walked away. Vindication wasn't about being right, it was about being able to offer a hand to the man who had once tried to push you down. The following year, Jed went to the bank. The Henderson farm was still for sale, its price now less than half of what Rich had paid. Jed sat down across the desk from Mr. Harris. He didn't ask for a loan. He slid a passbook across the desk. It was his savings account. He had enough. He bought the 160 acres for cash. The first thing he did on his new land was not to plow it. He fired up the HD5 dozer. He spent a week clearing the weeds, pushing the tangled mess into piles to be burned. The scream of the Detroit engine was a declaration, a reclaiming of the land from the silence of failure. As he worked, he saw a car pull up on the road. It was Rich Miller. He got out and just stood there, watching the old dozer work. After a while, Jed idled the machine down and climbed off. He walked over to the fence. "You're cleaning it up," Rich said, his voice raspy. "Needs it," Jed replied. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the loping clatter of the two-stroke diesel. "I was wrong, Jed," Rich said finally, his eyes on the black dirt. "I was a fool. I thought the new way was the only way. I thought you were a dinosaur." He looked up, his eyes meeting Jed's. Turns out the dinosaurs knew how to survive the Ice Age. Jed just nodded. "It's good land." "The best," Rich said, a hint of the old pride in his voice, quickly followed by the pain of his loss. "I'm gonna need a hand farming it," Jed said, as if he were talking about the weather. "It's too much for one man. I'll need someone who knows this ground." Rich stared at him, his mouth agape. He understood the offer. It wasn't charity, it was a job, a chance, a way back. I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything," Jed said, turning to walk back to the dozer. "Just be here Monday morning. We'll start with the fences." And so they did. Rich Miller came to work for Jedediah Stone, farming the very land he had once owned. The community watched, astonished. The roles were completely reversed. Rich, humbled and quiet, learned from Jed. He learned how to weld a broken part instead of buying a new one. He learned how to listen to an engine and know what it needed. He learned the difference between debt and wealth. And in time, the bitterness faded, replaced by a quiet respect. They became partners in a way. Two sides of the same coin, two men who had learned the same lesson from opposite ends of fortune. Years passed, the farm crisis eased, and a new, more cautious stability returned to the heartland. Jed never got big. He never bought a brand new tractor. The 4020, its rebuilt engine now seasoned and reliable, still earned its keep. The old HD5 sat behind the barn, a sleeping giant, its work mostly done. Jed's son, a young man with his father's quiet eyes and capable hands, grew up on that farm. He learned to drive on the Farmall M. He learned mechanics with his hands deep in the guts of the 4020. One Saturday afternoon, Jed found him out by the old dozer, staring at the strange arrangement of levers and pedals. "What do you think?" Jed asked, coming to stand beside him. "It's loud," the boy said. "It is that," Jed chuckled. "That's a Detroit diesel. They call them screamin' jimmies. Your great-granddad always said they sound like they're tearing themselves apart, but they'll run forever." Jed pulled himself up onto the steel pan seat. "Come on up." The boy climbed up and stood beside him. Jed flipped the master switch and hit the starter. The engine exploded into its chaotic, roaring life, the whole machine vibrating with raw power. Jed looked at his son, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He throttled the engine down to its loping idle and pointed out across their land. He pointed to their fields, then to the Henderson place next door. "See all this?" Jed said, his voice raised over the clatter of the engine. "This isn't just dirt, it's freedom. We don't owe any man a dime for it. Remember that. It's not about having the biggest or the shiniest. It's about owning what you have. Your land, your iron, your own two hands. That's the only real wealth there is." The boy nodded, understanding. He looked at the old, rusty machine, then at his father's steady hands on the controls. He listened to the angry, defiant roar of the engine, a sound that had echoed through the best and worst of times. It wasn't the sound of money or progress, it was the sound of independence. It was the sound of a legacy forged not in a banker's office, but in the grease and steel and stubborn heart of a man who knew his own worth.